The world was a clamor of bronze and boasting. In the cities that swelled along the Fertile Crescent, men built towers not to praise God, but to seize heaven for themselves, their laughter echoing off sun-baked brick like the rattle of dry bones. The noise was constant, the ring of hammers shaping swords instead of plowshares, the shouts of merchants cheating at the gates, the whispered plots in shadowed alleys. It was a world deafened by its own pride, a world that had forgotten the quiet language of the divine. But Noah, son of Lamech, heard a different sound. It was not a sound for the ears, but for the soul. It began as a low hum beneath the floor of the world, a vibration of sorrow that resonated in his chest as he tended his vines under the Mesopotamian sun. He was a righteous man, a simple man, whose hands knew the feel of earth and the heft of a pruning hook. His prayers were not for power or for wealth, but for the clarity of the morning light and the health of his family. Yet this new sound, this profound grief from the heart of creation, began to drown everything else out. He would close his eyes and see not the faces of his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, but a world submerged in grey, silent water. He would try to hear the voice of his wife, Naamah, but her words would be lost in a rushing roar that existed only in his mind. This was the beginning of his sacrifice, not of an animal upon an altar, but of his own peace. He was sacrificing his sanity at the altar of a terrifying, encroaching truth. He fought it. He worked his vineyard until his muscles screamed and his back ached, hoping exhaustion would grant him a silent night. He prayed with the others, mouthing ancient words while the hum in his spirit grew into a thrum, then a tremor. He was a part of this world, yet he was being pulled away from it by an invisible current. The people saw the change in him. His eyes, once clear and steady, now seemed to be looking at a distant horizon no one else could see. They would mock him. "The wine has gone to your head, old Noah. Are you listening for the gods in the grapevines?" He bore their scorn in silence, another piece of his old life flaking away like dried mud. The sacrifice of his reputation. One evening, as a storm gathered dust from the plains but offered no rain, the voice finally broke through the hum. It was not a voice of air and vibration, but of pure intention, imprinted directly upon his heart. It spoke of regret. It spoke of a world so beautiful in its design, now so marred by the violence of the men who walked it. It spoke of a cleansing, a great sorrowful washing that would return the earth to its first silence. And in the center of this terrible revelation came the command, a plan of impossible scale, her vessel of gopher wood, of specific and immense dimension, sealed with pitch from within and without. An ark, a floating refuge against the unmaking of the world. Noah fell to his knees in the dust of his vineyard, the weight of the words pressing the air from his lungs. This was not a request, it was a destiny. To accept it was to sacrifice everything. His name, his family's future, their place in the world. It was to embrace an absurdity so profound that it bordered on madness. He would become a fool in the eyes of all men to remain obedient in the eyes of one God. His wife found him there, his face streaked with dirt and tears. She touched his shoulder, her touch the only anchor in his swirling reality. "Noah," Naamah whispered, her voice trembling. "What is it? What have you heard?" He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw not madness but a terrible, resolute clarity. The spiritual sacrifice was complete. He had let go of his own understanding, his own comfort, his own world, to grasp a divine and dreadful purpose. "I promise," he said, his voice raspy, a stranger to his own ears, and a warning. "God will grieve, and the earth will be born again from water." The next morning, before the sun had burned the chill from the air, Noah walked past his vineyard, past the familiar patterns of his life. He walked toward the stand of tall, straight gopher wood trees on the ridge. He carried a bronze axe, its edge sharpened to a fine gleam. The world was still loud around him, full of the sounds of men and their ambitions. But for Noah there was only a great solemn quiet and the feeling of God's tears waiting to fall. He raised the axe, the muscles in his arms and back coiling. The first strike against the wood would not just be the felling of a tree. It would be the sound of his agreement, the shattering of his old life, and the first echo of a coming storm. The bronze axe fell, its report a crack of thunder in the quiet morning. The sound was not of wood splitting, but of a covenant being sealed in violence. Chips of gopher wood, pale as bone, flew into the air. Noah did not pause. The second strike followed, and the third, a grim rhythm against the world's careless melody. His sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, arrived as the sun climbed higher, their faces a mixture of duty and bewilderment. They had heard the command from their father's lips, but to see it enacted, to see the first of the great trees groaning, leaning towards its death, made the prophecy feel terribly real. Ham, the most connected to the world below, hesitated. "Father," he began, his voice low, "the merchants from Enoch are in the valley. They say a new ziggurat is planned, a tower to honor the ingenuity of man. They laugh at us. They call you the madman of the ridge." Noah turned, his face streaked with sweat and sawdust. His eyes held no anger, only that same unnerving clarity. "Their ingenuity is a monument to themselves, my son. We build an altar to the one who gave them breath. Their laughter is the sound of hollow reeds in the wind. It will not last. The work consumed them. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The clearing on the ridge became a shipyard on a mountain, an offense to logic and landscape. Under Noah's direction, they measured and cut, their hands raw from the adze and the saw. The scent of resin and pitch became their world, a thick, cloying incense of their strange devotion. Noah's wife, her name a quiet prayer on his lips, would bring them water and bread, her eyes full of a faith that wrestled daily with fear. She saw the cost of this obedience not just in the sweat on their brows, but in the growing distance between their family and the world. Old friends no longer visited. Trade caravans altered their routes to avoid the unsettling spectacle. The sacrifice was not merely Noah's, it was a blade that severed them all from the life they had known. Children would creep up the ridge, daring each other to touch the colossal skeletal frame, then run away shrieking with laughter, their minds unable to comprehend the purpose of a vessel so far from any sea. The structure that rose was a brutalist masterpiece of divine engineering, 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high. It had no sail, no rudder, no elegant prow to cleave the waves. It was not a ship for sailing. It was a container for survival, a scar of geometry on the face of the earth. Noah, guided by the memory of God's voice, directed the placement of every beam, the sealing of every seam with pitch, inside and out. He was no longer just a vintner, a patriarch. He had become a prophet of wood and measure, his every action a prayer of compliance. One evening, as the sun set the sky ablaze in hues of orange and purple, Ham stood beside him, looking down at the twinkling lights of a settlement in the valley. The sounds of music and celebration drifted up to them. "They are marrying and giving in marriage," Ham said, a bitter edge to his voice. "They live. We are building a tomb." Noah placed a heavy, calloused hand on his son's shoulder. He did not look at the valley. His eyes were on the unblemished horizon, the vast, empty canvas of the sky. "We are all in a tomb, my son. They have just furnished theirs more comfortably. Their songs are a lullaby they sing to themselves to forget the darkness outside the walls." The conversation was a mirror of Noah's own internal struggle. In the dead of night, he would lie awake, the immense silence of his faith pressing down on him. He would feel the phantom weight of all the lives he was not saving, the faces of the men he traded with, the children who played near his vineyard. This was the deepest cut of the spiritual sacrifice, to accept a salvation that required the damnation of everyone else. He was not a hero confronting a corrupt regime to save the innocent. He was the sole agent of a righteous, terrifying power, a power whose grand strategy involved washing the slate clean. His task was not to fight the coming storm, but to build the vessel that would allow him to float upon the wreckage. As the final planks were laid and the great door was fitted into its frame, the world had grown completely deaf to him. He was a relic, a monument to a forgotten fear. The ark stood finished, a dark, silent behemoth under a placid sky. Noah had preached, he had warned, but his words were absorbed by the noise of ambition and pleasure. His sacrifice was now complete. He had given up his name, his comfort, his community, and his own understanding of mercy. He had traded it all for a promise whispered on the wind, a promise of grief and water, and a world born again. He stood before the enormous vessel, a lonely shepherd waiting for a flood in a desert, his soul as quiet and cavernous as the ark itself, ready for the first tear of God to fall. The days that followed were a new kind of silence, not the quiet of a finished work, but the hollow stillness of a tomb waiting for its occupant. The sun rose and set over the plains of Shurupak, each day a perfect, cloudless replica of the last. Children would dare each other to touch the strange pitched wood of the behemoth, their laughter a sharp, piercing sound, that Noah no longer registered. Merchants on their way to the city would stop, point and speculate. A monument to madness, they called it. Der king's folly without a kingdom. Noah moved through these days like a ghost in his own life. He and his family prepared the interior, stocking seeds, grain, and dried fruits, their movements methodical, their words few. His wife, whose name he sometimes felt he had forgotten in the long years of labor, would watch him, her eyes a well of unspoken questions. Had he sacrificed their sons' futures for a divine fever dream? Shem, Ham, and Japheth worked with the grim obedience of men who had long ago stopped asking why. They had traded wives and futures among their kin for a place on this vessel, their own sacrifices mirroring their father's, yet lacking the fire of his conviction. They had faith in their father, but the sky remained stubbornly, cruelly blue. Then one morning the air changed. It was not a wind, but a charge, a hum that seemed to rise from the baked Mesopotamian earth itself. Noah felt it in his bones, a vibration that answered the quiet cavern of his soul. He walked to the open door of the ark and looked to the horizon. At first it was a smudge of dust, then a line, then a slow-moving river of life. They came not in a panicked stampede, but in a solemn, ordered procession that defied all laws of nature. The lion, its mane a dusty gold, walked near the gazelle. The wolf padded silently beside the lamb. 2 by 2, a silent covenant of fur, feather, and scale, they moved toward the ark. There was no roar, no cry, no territorial dispute. It was a pilgrimage of the condemned, led by an instinct older than fear. Noah and his sons stood aside, their hammers and adzes forgotten. This was not their work. They were merely stewards of the vessel. The creatures of the world, from the great elephant to the smallest desert mouse, filed past him, their eyes holding a deep, wild understanding that no human scoffer had possessed. They entered the cavernous dark, finding their designated places as if they had rehearsed this moment for 1,000 generations. The air grew thick with the scent of countless animals, a primal incense of the world that was. For 7 days and 7 nights the procession continued. The people of the land, who had once laughed, now watched in stunned, fearful silence from a distance. The strange, orderly parade was a more terrifying omen than any of Noah's shouted warnings. Their laughter died in their throats, replaced by a cold unease. On the 7th day, the last pair of creatures, 2 small brown sparrows, fluttered into the ark. The great ramp was drawn in. Noah stood at the threshold, looking out one last time. He saw the faces of his neighbors, the path he used to walk, the distant glimmer of the city where he was born. He had given it all up. He was no longer Noah of Shurapak. He was Noah of the ark, a citizen of a world not yet born. He turned away from the light, and his sons, with a heave of straining muscles, began to push the colossal door. It groaned, the sound of a world ending, the shriek of gopher wood and pitch sealing them into the promised darkness. The lock, a great wooden beam designed by God himself, fell into place with a boom that echoed through the hull. And then absolute silence, absolute darkness. The family huddled together, the only warmth in a vast waiting void. For a moment there was nothing, not a sound from man or beast, and in that perfect breathless quiet, a single heavy drop of water struck the roof of the ark, a sound like a solitary drumbeat, then another, then a dozen. The patter became a drumming, the drumming a roar, a relentless, deafening cascade that seemed intent on shattering the very timbers around them. Through the wood they could hear the first surprised shouts from outside, the cries turning to panic. The sound of a world drowning was not a great wave, but the terrified, muffled screams of a million voices, slowly, inexorably being silenced by the patient, cleansing tears of God. Noah closed his eyes, not in relief but in profound sorrow. The promise was being kept. His sacrifice was now bearing its terrible, beautiful fruit. He was afloat. The water rose. For days that bled into weeks, the only calendar was the rhythm of their chores, a metronome against the ceaseless percussion of the rain. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp fur, soured grain, and the close, unwashed scent of 8 human bodies sharing a space designed for survival, not comfort. Light was a rumor, a pale, milky memory that filtered through the single window high in the ark's ceiling, a zohar that did little to pierce the oppressive gloom of the lower decks. Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, moved with the grim efficiency of men who had forgotten what it was to stand on still earth. Their days were a cycle of hauling water, distributing feed, and shoveling dung into the sloshing bilge, their movements synchronized to the sickening, perpetual sway of their world. The groaning of the wood was a constant companion, a reminder of the immense pressure of the waters that held them suspended between a drowned past and an unknowable future. It was in the quiet moments, if such a thing could be said to exist amidst the lowing, chattering, and hissing of 1,000 captive beasts, that the true weight of their isolation settled. Naama, his wife, would sit mending a tunic by the flickering light of an oil lamp, her face a mask of stoic resolve, but Noah saw the tremor in her hands. He saw the way his daughters-in-law would stare at the rough-hewn walls, their eyes lost, likely picturing the homes, the markets, the friends now lost beneath the waves. His family had been saved, but their spirits were imprisoned. This was a sacrifice he hadn't fully comprehended, not just the loss of the world, but the slow erosion of the soul in the suffocating silence of God's judgment. One evening, as the ark pitched violently in the grip of a storm that felt angrier than the rest, Ham confronted him. His face, slick with sweat and grime, was contorted with a grief that had curdled into anger. "How long, father?" he demanded, his voice barely a whisper but sharp enough to cut through the din. "How long must we listen to this? To the world dying?" Noah looked at his second son, a man whose heart had always been wilder, more attuned to the earth than his brothers. He saw not just defiance but a profound spiritual wound. "Until the Lord's purpose is fulfilled," Noah answered, his voice weary. "Purpose?" Ham scoffed, a bitter, ragged sound. "What purpose is there in this endless darkness? We are keepers of a floating tomb. The cries we heard, they were our people. The baker in the village, the children who played by the well, did their sins weigh so much more than ours that they deserved? This?" The question hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was the question Noah had banished to the deepest corners of his own heart, the one he wrestled with in the pre-dawn hours when the only sound was his own breathing. He had offered the sacrifice of his obedience, building the vessel and gathering the creatures as commanded. He had endured the mockery, the scorn of his neighbors. But now God demanded a different kind of sacrifice, a spiritual one. He had to sacrifice his own comfort, his own need for easy answers, and become the vessel for a faith his own family was beginning to lose. He had to believe for all of them. He placed a hand on Ham's shoulder. "I do not have the answers you seek, my son. I do not know the mind of the Almighty, nor the weight he places on each soul. I only know the weight of his command. My sacrifice was to obey. Yours, ours, is to endure, to trust that the dawn will come, even when our eyes see only darkness, to believe that this cleansing is not an end but a violent, terrible beginning." Ham pulled away, unconvinced, his eyes mirroring the turbulent waters outside. The rift between them, a hairline crack, had begun to form. In the weeks that followed, Noah made his own private pilgrimage through the ark each day. He would walk past the pens, the air thick with the musky scent of the great cats from the lands of Cush, their amber eyes glowing in the gloom. He would listen to the soft calls of the doves, a sound of peace in a world of turmoil. He spoke to the animals, not in words, but in a shared language of survival. He saw in their wild, uncomprehending eyes a reflection of his own predicament, torn from their homes, subject to a will beyond their understanding, waiting for a promise to be fulfilled. He was their shepherd, but he too was just a beast in the Lord's pen. His sorrow had not lessened, but it had changed. It was no longer the sharp grief for the lost, but a deeper, more profound ache. It was the sorrow of understanding. He was the fulcrum of history, the man chosen to witness the unmaking of a world so that it could be remade. The terrible beauty of the fruit he was bearing was not just survival, but the immense, crushing responsibility of memory. He and his family were all that was left. They were the world's memory. If they allowed bitterness to consume them, if they allowed doubt to shatter their faith, then the sacrifice would be for nothing. The new world would be born poisoned by the old. One morning, 150 days into their journey by his careful count, he felt a change, a subtle shift in the ark's endless motion. It was not a lurch, but a shudder, a deep, solid jolt that ran up through the soles of his feet. The relentless rocking eased, replaced by a strange and unfamiliar stillness. A cry went up from Shem on the upper deck. "Father, father, come quickly!" Noah's heart hammered against his ribs. He climbed the ladder, his old bones protesting, and emerged into the pale light of the upper deck. His family was gathered by the great window, their faces pressed against the translucent covering. He pushed through them and looked out. There was no land, not yet, but there, piercing the grey sheet of the endless ocean, was a peak. The majestic, snow-dusted summit of a mountain. Ararat, the Ark had come to rest. The rain had long since stopped, but for the first time in months Noah felt tears on his own cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow or of relief, but of a man who had sacrificed his own understanding and been given a glimpse of God's. He had been adrift on a sea of judgment, and now he was anchored to a promise. The voyage was not over, but the drowning was. He was no longer just afloat. He was home. He was no longer just afloat. He was home. Naamah, his wife, came to stand beside him, her hand finding the small of his back. Her touch was an anchor in itself, a connection to the life they had lived before the rain began, a life of soil and sun and predictability. He felt her tremble, a fine, quiet tremor that spoke of an exhaustion so deep it had settled into her very bones. For 480 years they had walked together, but the last year had aged them more than the previous century. "It is real?" she whispered, her voice rough with disuse and emotion. Her breath fogged a small patch of the translucent gopher wood covering. "It is as real as the promise that brought us here," Noah replied, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. He looked at the faces of his sons and their wives. Shem, his firstborn, stood solid and dependable, his gaze already calculating, measuring the slope of the mountain, the practicalities of their new reality. Ham's eyes were wide, alight with a restless energy, a desperate craving to be free of the Ark's confines, to feel solid ground to run. Japheth, ever the quietest, simply stared, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe, as if he were looking upon the first dawn of creation itself. They had all sacrificed. They had forsaken their friends, their homes, the very fabric of the world they knew, to follow the mad vision of their father. They had hammered pegs and stretched pitch alongside him, enduring the same scorn, the same pitying glances from those who were now nothing but memory lost beneath the waves. His sacrifice had demanded theirs, a generational offering of faith laid at an unseen altar. He turned from the window. The singular image of the peak burned into his mind. The air within the great vessel was thick with the scent of damp wood, of animals, of life kept in close quarters for an eternity. For months this scent had been the smell of survival. Now it felt like the smell of a tomb from which they were about to be resurrected. The silence was the most unsettling part. The constant creaking of the massive timbers, the groan of the hull against the ceaseless water, the percussive drumming of the rain, these sounds had become the heartbeat of their world. Now there was only a profound echoing stillness, broken by the shuffling of a hoof in the lower deck or the rustle of a bird's wings. Noah walked slowly, his hand trailing along the rough-hewn interior wall. Every splinter, every knot in the wood was a testament. He remembered the day he had felled this very tree, the sweat stinging his eyes under the Mesopotamian sun. He remembered the jeers of the passers-by. "The old man builds a boat on a dry hill," they had taunted. Has the sun cooked his mind? They could not comprehend a flood in a land of droughts. They could not imagine a judgment so total, so absolute. To them his work was the pinnacle of foolishness. But his sacrifice had not been the wood, or the years of his life spent in labor. It had not even been his reputation. The true sacrifice had been his own certainty. He had been forced to surrender the logic of the world he knew, the predictable cycle of seasons, the stable earth beneath his feet, and cling only to the word of a God who promised to unravel it all. Every morning he had woken with the cold stone of doubt in his gut, a temptation to believe the mockers, to abandon the impossible task. And every morning he had sacrificed that doubt, nailing it to the growing frame of the ark with his own hammer. He had chosen to believe in a God of water over a world of dust. Now that choice had been vindicated, but there was no triumph in his heart, only a deep, humbling sobriety. The cost of their survival had been the entirety of creation. He was the patriarch of a ghost world, the king of a silent kingdom. He reached the great door, the seal of pitch still holding it fast. He laid his palm flat against the wood. Outside was a world washed clean, a world waiting, but it was not yet time. The water had to recede. The earth had to heal. The divine command to leave had not yet come. Their journey of faith was not over. It had merely entered a new phase. The sacrifice of action was done. Now came the sacrifice of patience. A thought, clear and bright as the mountain peak, formed in his mind. The first thing, the very first act upon setting foot on that new earth, must be one of remembrance, an altar, not of celebration but of gratitude, of acknowledgement. He would build an altar of uncut stones, as was proper, for no tool of man should shape that which was meant to honor the divine hand that had reshaped the world. He would offer a sacrifice, a clean beast, not as a desperate plea for deliverance, but as a humble recognition of it. The smoke would rise into the clean air, the first prayer of a new humanity, a scent of thanksgiving to the heavens that had wept for 40 days and were now, at last, clear. It would be a final, necessary sacrifice to give back to God the first fruits of the life that God himself had preserved. This, he knew, was the only way to begin, the only way to step out of the ark, not as a mere survivor, but as a steward of the covenant, a man anchored forever to the promise that had brought him home. So what did you think? If you enjoyed the story, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next episode.